Imagine stepping into your regular bank, planning to deposit money you earned honestly, only to find yourself in handcuffs before anyone even checks if the check's legit. Funny how fast life can change, right? One moment you're doing something completely normal, and the next, the ground shifts beneath you. That's exactly how it unfolded for Adrian Foster, a warehouse supervisor from Toledo, Ohio. It was a typical Friday afternoon, the kind that feels like it's leaning into the weekend already. The sun was bright, the streets around Monroe Street were buzzing, cars heading to the mall, folks thinking about dinner spots or early drinks. But Adrian wasn't caught up in any of that. His thoughts were heavier. Sitting in the passenger seat of his beat-up Ford Fusion was a cashier's check for $10,000. No lottery, no backdoor deals. Just the sale of his late father's 1978 Buick Regal, a car that had collected dust in the garage for years, but carried the weight of memories. Letting it go hadn't been easy. Adrian had plans for that money. A college fund for his niece, maybe a few upgrades to the house. Whatever it was, he was determined to use it right. He pulled into the parking lot of his usual Fifth Third Bank branch, the same one he'd used for over a decade. He took the envelope from the seat beside him, stepped out, and headed inside. What he didn't know was that by the time he'd walk back out, everything would be different. His wrists would be sore from steel cuffs, phones would be recording, and whispers would follow him out the door. Inside, the bank was mildly busy. 3 people in line ahead, 2 older women filling out forms off to the side, and a young mom trying to soothe her toddler's tantrum. Adrian gave a polite nod to the security guard and got in line. This place was familiar to him. He'd deposited paychecks here, made mortgage payments, even refinanced his car through this same branch. When it was finally his turn, he stepped up to the counter where a young teller named Rachel Kim, probably in her late 20s, greeted him with the standard, "Hi, how can I help you today?" Adrian placed the envelope in front of her. "Just here to deposit a check," he said evenly. Rachel opened it and scanned the figure. 10,000, she murmured, then looked up at Adrian, and then back down again. Her eyes lingered a little too long. "Do you have an account with us?" she asked, not unfriendly, but cautious. "Yes, ma'am," Adrian replied. "Been with this bank going on 11 years. She nodded and began typing into her system. Then she asked for his ID, which he handed over without pause. She examined his license, glanced again at the check, and her expression subtly changed, like something didn't quite add up in her mind. She gave a small glance toward another teller, then leaned back slightly. "Give me just a moment," she said, standing and walking toward a man in a navy suit, probably the branch manager. Adrian watched them exchange quiet words. The man's eyes darted toward him, then toward the check in her hand. Adrian stood patiently, hands in his pockets, but something about the air shifted. The line behind him was growing, and he could hear someone sigh audibly with impatience. The manager came over, polite but with a formal edge to his tone. "Mr. Foster, can you tell me where you got this check?" "Sure," Adrian said without hesitation. "Sold my father's old car. Guy in town gave me a cashier's check for it." The manager nodded, a little too tight-lipped. Then came the line that always means trouble. "We're just going to need a few minutes to verify it." And that's when Adrian saw it. Rachel pressing something underneath the counter. A discreet movement, but unmistakable. His stomach turned. He knew what that button was. Still, he didn't react. No raised voice. No sudden moves. He just stood there, staring at a check that was supposed to mean opportunity, not humiliation. Then came the sirens. Even before they pulled into the lot, the story was already shifting. But before we talk about flashing lights and handcuffs, let's talk about who Adrian Foster really is. See, some people walk into a room and get measured by assumptions, not by truth. But Adrian? Adrian was the kind of man whose life was stitched together by quiet discipline and steady work. He grew up on Toledo's east side, raised by his father Leonard after his mom passed when he was 12. Leonard wasn't a rich man. He punched a clock at the steel mill until his body gave out. Knees shot, lungs tired. But he showed Adrian what it meant to work with pride. Do the right thing, even if no one sees it. By the time Adrian turned 18, he was already helping pay the bills. Warehouse jobs, loading trucks in freezing weather, stacking boxes until his hands blistered, and he never once complained. He'd tell his dad, "As long as I've got 2 hands and a back that works, we're going to be okay." And he meant it. Now, at 38, he's a supervisor at a distribution center, overseeing a crew of 20. Not the kind of boss who shouts from an office. He's the kind who works the line with you, stays late if something's behind. People respect him because he's earned it. His home life is simple. A modest 2-bedroom on Detroit Avenue. The lawn's patchy, but he keeps trying to fix it up every spring. Lives alone, but the house is never empty on weekends. His sister Marissa and her daughter Tiana are always dropping by. His door, like his heart, stays open. Tiana was 10 now, bright-eyed, full of curiosity, the kind of kid who could turn a grocery run into 100 questions about the universe. To Adrian, she was more than just family. She was the future. He wanted the world to open wider for her than it ever had for him. That's why parting with his father's Buick wasn't just a sale. It was a sacrifice, one that carried the weight of legacy and hope. But Adrian didn't just carry memories. He carried invisible scars too, the kind that never make headlines, but change how you move through the world. He could still recall the night he was pulled over for driving too slow in a neighborhood deemed too nice. Or the time he was followed down every aisle of a hardware store like he might tuck a drill into his coat and bolt. Every time it happened, he swallowed the burn of humiliation, choosing to breathe through it instead of letting it boil over. His father had drilled that into him early on. "Son, you don't get to lose your temper. They're already waiting for that." That line settled in Adrian's chest years ago like a stone, and it never left. It shaped how he carried himself, always controlled, always deliberate. So now, standing inside that bank, he wasn't just a customer with a $10,000 check. He was a man who had earned every dollar, every ounce of dignity, the hard way. And yet, here he was, being looked at not as a valued client, but as a potential threat. If you had been there, you might have seen a composed man waiting quietly in line. But you wouldn't have seen the storm building beneath his stillness. Inside, Adrian's mind raced. He thought of Tiana. What would she say if she saw her uncle treated like a criminal for trying to do something honest? He thought of his father, how Leonard might have muttered under his breath, "Some things never change." Adrian shifted his stance slightly, glanced at his watch, and told himself what he always did in moments like this. Be patient, tell the truth, and let that be enough. But sometimes, truth doesn't get the first word, and patience doesn't keep the sirens away. Because those sirens he'd heard a few blocks away, they were coming. Fast. At first, they were just a faint wail in the distance, barely audible behind the hum of the bank's quiet routine. But Adrian noticed them before anyone else. He didn't flinch, didn't turn his head. He simply listened. Around him, the day continued like any other. The mother with the crying toddler was now gently rocking her child, whispering lullabies. The older women at the side counter laughed about some neighbor's noisy renovation. Everything appeared normal, except Adrian knew it wasn't. He looked toward the teller, Rachel. She had returned to her seat, her fingers now clicking a pen nervously against the desk. When she met his gaze for the briefest second, her eyes darted away, guilty. The manager stood nearby, trying to look busy on his tablet, but his glances kept landing right back on Adrian. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. "Everything okay?" he asked, voice even. The manager offered a smile that felt practiced and hollow. "Yes, sir. Just verifying the check. Shouldn't take long." Adrian nodded, but he could feel the truth slipping out of the room. This wasn't about the check anymore. He recognized the signs, the sidelong looks, the hushed whispers. The performance of politeness barely masking suspicion. Outside, the sirens grew louder, and someone in line behind Adrian noticed. A man in a blue windbreaker leaned forward, his tone impatient. "Hey man, are you almost done? Some of us got places to be." Adrian turned his head slightly, keeping his voice calm but firm. "Just trying to deposit a check. Same as you trying to handle your business." The man muttered something under his breath, but backed off. Adrian didn't have the bandwidth for pettiness. Not right now. Then the sirens cut, abrupt and sharp, like a record scratch across the moment. Adrian's chest tightened. He didn't need to see the squad cars to know they were right outside, lights flashing, tires cooling against the asphalt. The security guard by the entrance shifted. He tapped his radio once, then looked at Adrian with a mixture of unease and expectation. Adrian took a slow breath. "So this is where we're going," he murmured under his breath. And then it happened. The bank doors swung open hard, and 3 officers entered like a wave. The first was broad-shouldered and bald, his uniform straining against his frame. The second was leaner, eyes sharp beneath his cap. A third stayed near the door, scanning the room like he expected chaos to break out any second. The room stilled. Conversation vanished. The young mother clutched her child tightly. The older women turned with startled eyes. Even the man who had rushed Adrian a moment ago suddenly seemed unsure, stepping slightly away. The heavy-set officer's voice boomed across the room. "Sir, I need you to step away from the counter." Adrian's heart pounded, but his face stayed composed. He lifted one hand slightly, not high, just enough to show it was empty. "Officer, can you tell me what this is about?" "Step away from the counter," the officer repeated, sharper this time. Adrian looked to Rachel, then the manager. Both avoided his gaze. Pale, silent, like the truth suddenly cost too much to speak. So Adrian did what he always did. He stayed calm. He moved back slowly, hands visible, his tone steady. "I came in here to deposit a check. That's all." The slimmer officer stepped forward now, his voice more measured. "We just need to ask you a few questions, sir." Adrian gave a small nod, though his insides were clenched tight. Questions? He could answer questions. But it was the tone, the posture, the assumption baked into every gesture. This wasn't curiosity. It was accusation without charge. The manager shuffled papers like he was pretending to be busy, anything to avoid looking Adrian in the eye. And with each passing second, the silence got heavier. Adrian's mind drifted to Tiana again. What would she think if she saw this? If she saw how easily a man like her uncle could be treated like a suspect, just for trying to do something right? Her uncle, being treated like a criminal, pulled aside in front of everyone like he'd tried to rob the place. And all for walking into a bank with his own money. The thought wasn't even fully formed in Adrian's mind before he felt a firm hand wrap around his wrist. The officer's grip wasn't harsh, not yet, but it didn't need to be. It was a signal. Adrian didn't resist. He kept his voice steady, loud enough for the whole lobby to hear. "Officer," he said, locking eyes with the slimmer one. "This is a cashier's check from the sale of my father's car. I've banked here for over a decade. You can verify that." The heavy-set officer didn't blink. "We'll handle that outside," he said flatly. "Let's go." The atmosphere in the bank shifted like someone had closed off the air. Adrian turned to look at Rachel, the teller who'd taken his check. Her face had gone pale, lips pressed into a tight, trembling line. She finally spoke, her voice cracking. It didn't look right." Adrian's head tilted slightly. "Didn't look right," he repeated. "What didn't?" Rachel glanced toward the manager, silently pleading for backup, but he didn't say a word. Just adjusted his tie and kept his eyes anywhere but on Adrian. "The amount," she mumbled, almost too quiet to hear. "Sometimes checks like that, they turn out to be fake." Adrian took a slow breath, trying to keep the heat in his chest from spilling out. "You had my ID. You had access to my account, 11 years of records. Not once have I given this bank a single issue. And you couldn't ask one more question before calling them?" He nodded toward the officers. "You just assumed." The words landed like a heavy weight. The 2 older women near the counter exchanged nervous glances. Even the impatient man from the line earlier seemed visibly uncomfortable now. Rachel fiddled with her pen again, avoiding Adrian's eyes. The manager finally stepped in, his voice professionally flat. "Sir, you have to understand, banks have procedures. When someone brings in a large check, we're trained to flag it for review. $10,000 is the reporting threshold. Adrian's voice dropped, sharper now. And the red flag was what? My skin? My jacket? My face? That question didn't shout. It didn't need to. It was raw, direct, a mirror. And suddenly, no one had anything to say. Only the faint sound of the toddler whimpering broke the silence. The slimmer officer looked at Adrian carefully. He hadn't put on the cuffs yet, but his partner was growing impatient, his fingers twitching near his belt. Sir, the younger officer said cautiously, if what you're saying is accurate, you'll have every opportunity to clear it up. But for now, we're asking you to step outside. Adrian looked around the room. Every eye was locked on him. Some watched with quiet pity, others with judgment, but none of them could look away. He stood tall, voice calm. I'll go, but I need everyone here to see this for what it is. I walked into this bank to deposit money from selling my father's car. And before I could explain a thing, I was treated like a suspect. Not because of the check, but because of who I am. Rachel shifted where she stood. The manager cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable, but neither of them denied it. The heavy-set officer tugged Adrian's arm. Outside. Now. Adrian didn't resist. He let them lead him to the doors, his thoughts spiraling. He pictured the Buick. He saw his father under its hood, tools in hand, teaching him how to change a filter. He thought about Tiana, how she once asked why strangers sometimes stared at her too long in the store. And he remembered the promise he'd made. The world will be fair if you work hard enough. But here he was, living proof that fairness wasn't always invited to the room. As the glass doors swung open, the sight outside hit him like a punch. Red and blue lights flashed like alarms across the strip mall's facade. 2 squad cars parked diagonally near the entrance, a third idling at the curb like it was waiting for someone to be taken away. Adrian stepped into the heat of the afternoon. But it wasn't the sun that made him sweat. It was the spotlight of judgment. Shoppers from the nail salon nearby had stopped mid-step, eyes fixed on him. A man holding a bag of takeout already had his phone out, recording. Someone whispered, "What did he do?" The heavy-set officer tightened his grip. "Hands behind your back." Adrian didn't flinch. "Officer," he said, his tone level, "I haven't committed a crime. I came here to deposit money I earned. That's all." "You can explain that downtown," the officer snapped, pulling out the handcuffs. The metal locked around Adrian's wrists, cold, sharp, humiliating. The crowd murmured louder now. People were shifting, whispering, watching. "Wait," the slimmer officer said, holding up a hand. His tone was calmer. "Did anyone inside confirm the check was fake?" Rachel stood frozen in the doorway. The manager lingered behind her, his face stiff. Neither one spoke. Adrian seized that pause. He turned toward the younger officer. "You see that? They're not even sure. They don't know a thing. They assumed, and now I'm standing here in cuffs." The younger officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. His eyes moved between Adrian, the bank staff, and the onlookers gathering nearby. It was all starting to feel wrong. But his partner wasn't waiting. The heavy-set officer began nudging Adrian toward the nearest squad car. "You're being detained for questioning." Adrian set his jaw, his voice cutting through the noise. "Detained for what? For carrying a check with my name on it? For selling my father's car? Or is it because I look like someone who shouldn't have $10,000? That hit hard. The man with the takeout lowered his phone, his face shifting, from curiosity to something more uncomfortable. Something that looked a lot like shame. A woman near the entrance whispered to her friend, "That's messed up." Her voice was quiet, but in the tension of the moment, it cut through like a bell. The younger officer finally stepped forward. "Let me see the check," he said. The bank manager hesitated, his posture stiff, then slowly brought over the envelope. The officer opened it, holding the cashier's check up to the light. He studied it carefully. Watermark, routing number, everything in place. Adrian caught the man's eye. "That's because it's real," he said, steady and low. "Because I'm telling the truth." Still, the heavy-set officer kept Adrian pressed against the squad car. His grip tightened, and his voice grew impatient. "We'll confirm it at the station." Adrian exhaled, and this time, the frustration cracked through his voice. You're not even trying to hear me. You want me to be guilty so bad, you won't even listen. The younger officer shifted his stance, clearly uncomfortable. He didn't say anything, not yet, but you could feel the distance growing between the two men in uniform. The silence between them was thick with tension. Across the sidewalk, a teenage boy stood clutching a skateboard, eyes locked on Adrian. Maybe 14, maybe younger, but old enough to understand what he was seeing. Adrian noticed him, and shame hit him, not for anything he'd done, but for what this kid was being taught in real time. He turned his head slightly toward the younger officer. "Sir," Adrian said, his voice quieter now, "you can cuff me. You can drag me to the station, but at least give me the chance to speak. Don't just let this happen without asking why." The officer didn't answer right away. One hand rested near his holster, but his eyes stayed fixed on Adrian, longer this time. He looked torn, suspended between policy and conscience. Before he could decide, the heavy-set officer yanked open the squad car door. The hinges groaned, like even the car was reluctant to be part of this. Adrian stood his ground, hands cuffed behind him, chest tight with restraint. The metal bit into his wrists, but he kept his voice even. "I'm telling the truth," he said. "That check, it's from the sale of my father's car. You can call the buyer. His name's right there. I've got the bill of sale. Everything you need." The younger officer looked down at the check again. He turned it under the sunlight, examining the watermark, the clean lines, the perforated edge. Then he looked at the manager. "Did you call the issuing bank to verify this?" The manager faltered. "Not yet. We followed protocol. Contacted the authorities first." "Protocol," Adrian repeated, his tone cutting now. "So that's your process? Call the cops before even picking up the phone to check? I've banked here for 11 years. Never once had a problem. And the first time I bring in a large check, this is what I get?" Rachel, the teller, shifted where she stood. Her voice wavered. It just seemed unusual. "People do commit fraud, sir." Adrian turned toward her, eyes sharp but voice controlled. "And what made me look like fraud to you? My ID? My banking history? Or the color of my hands when I handed you that envelope?" Silence fell over the scene like a heavy blanket. No one moved. The crowd outside was growing. Whispers rippled through. "He's right," someone muttered. "They didn't even check," another added. The younger officer finally looked Adrian square in the eye. "You said it was from a car sale?" "Yes," Adrian replied, gripping that small moment of hope. "In 1978 Buick Regal. My father's. Sold it last week to a man named Dominic Hayes. The bill of sale is in my glove compartment. You can check it right now. My father worked 3 decades in a steel plant. That car was the last thing he left me. I didn't want to sell it, but I needed to. I wanted to put the money toward my niece's college fund. That check isn't fake. It's his payment." The officer's expression changed, just a flicker, but real. He turned toward his partner. The heavy-set officer dismissed the concern with a grunt. "Doesn't matter. If it checks out, we'll cut him loose later." Adrian's voice rose, not with anger, but with urgency. "Later? Do you even understand what it means for me to be out here like this? In handcuffs, in front of this crowd, with that kid watching." He nodded toward the boy with the skateboard. "While you treat me like a criminal for trying to deposit my own money." The boy hadn't moved. His eyes hadn't left Adrian, and the weight of that gaze twisted something deep in Adrian's gut. He thought of Tiana, how she might grow up seeing her uncle treated this way, how she might think this was just normal. The younger officer fidgeted, visibly uneasy now. "If the paperwork's in the car," he started. "Then check it," Adrian said, cutting in, still calm, still respectful. "You've got the authority to verify this now. You don't have to keep playing like I'm a suspect." The heavy-set officer had had enough. He yanked Adrian's arm harder, pulling him closer to the back seat. "Enough." In the car. Adrian's jaw tightened, but he didn't budge. He looked one last time at the younger officer, locking eyes. "You can either listen to the truth right now," he said quietly, "or keep pretending you don't hear me. But once I speak, You're not going to be able to ignore it anymore. And this time, the younger officer didn't look away. He gave a small, slow nod. Then he raised a hand, stopping his partner. "Hold up," he said, his voice firm now. "Let's give him a chance to explain." Adrian let out the first real breath he'd been able to since the cuffs had gone on. Adrian shifted slightly, the steel still biting into the skin of his wrists. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice low but sincere. The younger officer stepped closer, lowering his tone so only Adrian could hear. "What do you want me to understand?" Adrian lifted his chin, his voice calm but weighted with years of experience. "I've worked warehouse jobs since I was 18. I've broken my back to pay bills, support my family, and do things the right way. I've had an account with this bank for over 11 years. Never bounced a check. Never caused trouble. Today, I walked in with a legitimate cashier's check, money from selling my late father's car, and before anyone even checked if it was real, I was treated like a thief. Like I didn't belong." The officer's eyes narrowed as he held the check up again, inspecting it under the light. "You've got the paperwork for the sale?" "I do," Adrian said firmly. "Bill of sale, buyer's name, contact info, everything. It's in the glove box. Check it, and you'll see I've been telling the truth from the beginning." The officer gave a slow nod and turned to his partner. "Let's verify before we escalate any further." But the heavy-set officer scoffed. "Protocol's clear. Detain, then verify." Adrian raised his voice slightly, just enough to carry across the crowd gathering nearby. "Protocol shouldn't come before people. That paperwork is sitting 30 feet away in my car. Why drag me through all this when the answer is right there?" That hit a nerve. Voices began to rise from the parking lot. "Let him prove it," someone shouted. Another called out, "This don't feel right." The pressure was shifting. The younger officer pointed toward the rows of parked cars. "Which one's yours?" "The silver Ford Fusion, 2 rows back." The officer nodded and motioned for another cop to retrieve the documents. The heavy-set officer rolled his eyes but didn't interfere. As they waited, Adrian turned slightly, his voice steady but unmistakably powerful, carrying across flashing lights and murmuring onlookers. "This isn't just about a check," he said. "This is about assumptions. About walking into a place where I've done business for over a decade and being treated like I couldn't possibly have that kind of money unless I did something wrong." He paused, locking eyes with no one in particular, but speaking to everyone. "You don't know what it's like to always be second-guessed, to live your life constantly having to prove you're worthy of the benefit of the doubt. I came here to deposit money, and the first thing they assumed was fraud, not because of the check, but because of me." The slimmer officer's jaw clenched, not out of frustration with Adrian, but because the truth of those words landed hard. Moments later, the officer who'd gone to the car returned with a folded document. He handed it to the slimmer officer, who opened it carefully. A signed and dated bill of sale. Buyer's name and contact information. All there. The officer exhaled through his nose. "It checks out," he said finally. Silence rippled through the crowd like a wave. The heavy-set officer's face twisted in irritation. The bank manager shifted awkwardly in the doorway. Rachel, the teller, looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. Adrian stood tall. The cuffs still dug into his wrists, but his voice was clear. "I told you. From the beginning." The younger officer hesitated for a beat, then quietly said, "Take the cuffs off." The heavy-set officer muttered something under his breath, but obeyed. The metal snapped open, and Adrian pulled his arms forward, rubbing the raw red marks around his wrists. He didn't raise his voice, didn't gloat. He simply stood there, silent, unwavering, a man who had just been publicly doubted and humiliated. But even without the cuffs, the damage was done. He looked down at the faint red lines, the evidence of broken trust carved into his skin. Around him, the crowd no longer looked on with suspicion. Their faces had shifted, no longer wondering what he had done, but reckoning with what had been done to him. The younger officer handed Adrian the check and paperwork. His voice was quiet, nearly apologetic. "Everything checks out. You're free to go." Adrian took the papers but didn't move right away. His gaze drifted toward the doorway where the manager and Rachel still stood, frozen. Then he turned back to the crowd. "You all saw it," he said, his voice steady, clear. "I walked in like any other customer. I handed over a real check. And before anyone tried to verify it, a silent alarm was pressed. The police were called. I was treated like I didn't belong, like I couldn't have earned what was already mine." Rachel's lips quivered. The manager adjusted his tie again, eyes fixed on the ground. Neither one said a word. The boy with the skateboard was still there, watching. Adrian met his gaze, and this time, he softened his tone. "Don't let anyone tell you that your worth is based on how they see you. It's not. You work hard. You do right. You belong here, just as much as anyone else." The boy nodded slowly, the moment sinking in. Adrian turned back to the younger officer. "You listened," he said. "You gave me a voice. I respect that. But the truth is, I shouldn't have to beg to be heard. I shouldn't need a crowd watching just to be believed." The officer gave a small nod. No argument. No excuse. Just quiet understanding. Finally, Adrian looked at the manager one last time. "I trusted this bank. That trust is gone now." He slid the check and the bill of sale back into the envelope, tucked it under his arm, and walked toward his car. The crowd parted for him, not in fear, but in quiet respect. Some nodded as he passed. Others just watched, thinking. Some in the crowd whispered quiet apologies, words Adrian would never hear. He opened the door to his car and paused, glancing back one last time. The flashing red and blue lights danced across the bank's windows, a distorted reflection of everything that had just unfolded. He thought of the Buick, of Tiana's bright future, of all the times he'd been told to stay calm, stay patient, stay polite. And he had. He'd done all of that. And still, here he was. Adrian eased into the driver's seat, shut the door, and sat in silence. His hands wrapped around the steering wheel, his wrists sore, pulsing from the weight of steel that had no business being there. But his spirit didn't tremble. If anything, it had never felt more grounded. That day had taught him something sharp and unshakable. No matter how perfectly you walk the line, no matter how tightly you hold to the rules, there are still moments when the world looks at you and decides you're suspicious. The test isn't whether those moments come. They will. The test is how you respond. Adrian chose honesty over fury. He chose clarity over confrontation. And in doing so, he didn't just defend his own truth. He made everyone around him confront theirs. As his car pulled away, the flashing lights in his rear view slowly disappeared. But the memory, the weight of what happened, stayed with him. It would always stay with him. And maybe, just maybe, it would stay with the people who watched it unfold too. Because sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one voice, one person standing their ground for others to finally see what they've been ignoring all along. So if you're listening to this story right now, ask yourself, when someone is mistreated in front of you, will you look away? Or will you speak? Will you hide behind protocol? Or will you stand for what's right? That choice, it's coming. And it'll arrive when you least expect it. If this story made you pause, don't just scroll past it. Share it. Talk about it. Let it echo. Because doing the right thing isn't about rules. It's about courage, especially when it counts the most. Thank you for watching. Subscribe me and hit the notification bell to not miss new stories. Bye.